Hi. I've been asked to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's found in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. And you know the story probably. The man is beaten and robbed and left for dead by the side of the road. And the Levite and the priest pass by and do nothing. And then the Samaritan stops and helps the man and takes him to the innkeeper and sees to it that his wounds are tended to and so forth. It's the parts that happen before and after the story that make it interesting. So first off, it says the lawyer wanted to test Jesus, and this expert in the Jewish law says to Jesus, let's see, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus answers the question with a question and says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And so then the lawyer makes 5 answers. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the 5 things. 4 of them have to do with loving God, and 1 of them has to do with loving your neighbor. So then Jesus says, you have answered right. Do this and you will live. Case closed, problem solved, right? But the lawyer is not ready to be done with this. And he asks Jesus another question. And he says, who is my neighbor? Now, this indicates that the lawyer is on track. And he's pretty astute about all of this. He's named 5 things. 4 of them have to do with loving God. 1 of them has to do with loving your neighbor. Jesus says, yeah, you answered right. And the lawyer, instead of focusing on the 4 things that the lawyer brought up, the lawyer brings up the 1 and goes deeper with that. Who is my neighbor, Jesus? Because you see the 80-20 rule at work here. Have you heard of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, where you get 80% of the results from 20% of the work? And it's used in all kinds of different applications. And we see it here in 20% of the lawyer's answer to Jesus. He knows that that's the critical part. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, rather than the other 80% about loving God. And this is so true. Jesus in John chapter 14, verse 15, said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So the 4 things, loving God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. The visible proof of those is in the 1/5, the 20%, loving your neighbor as yourself. So that's what the lawyer focuses on. He knows that's the critical piece. So he says, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story then. I find it fascinating in the story that Jesus tells that the one who was robbed was stripped. So here he is by the side of the road, and from his naked condition, we can't tell whether he's rich or poor. We can't tell whether he's religious or an atheist. We can't tell much of anything about him because he's been stripped. And there he is, half dead by the side of the road. So all opportunity for the priest or the Levite or the Samaritan to identify this man is taken away. He looks just like everybody else. Remember that there was no ethnic distinction between the Samaritans and the Jews. There was religious distinction, but they looked the same. They had the same heritage. So anyway, they can't tell. And it's the Samaritan who does what needs to be done and helps the man. That causes the lawyer to be aware of his own prejudice and the things that could stand in the way of him doing the right thing. This is the key issue that God is calling you to talk about in your own heart, to discuss with yourself right now. Do I love my neighbor? And who am I willing to consider my neighbor? The question applies to all of us. And Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And his commandment is, love your neighbor. I'm Bob Young. Thanks for watching.